Ragnarok, the Norse end of the world, Part 1. The end of the world does not begin with a battle, at least not if we listen carefully to the surviving sources. It begins more quietly. It begins with winter, with a sun that feels weaker than it should, with kinship loosening, with halls growing tense, with the old bonds of the world starting to fail before anyone has drawn a sword. Modern retellings often remember Ragnarok as spectacle, gods and monsters, fire, wolves, serpents, the last battle at the edge of time. Those images are in the tradition, but they are not the whole tradition. In the poems and medieval prose that preserve Ragnarok for us, the end is also a story about memory, transmission, and the terrifying question of what happens when order itself can no longer hold. The first caution is simple: there is no single Viking Bible. What survives comes to us through medieval Icelandic manuscripts, through poems copied after the conversion of Iceland to Christianity, and through the prose work of Snorri Sturluson, a 13th century Icelandic writer, politician, historian, and poet. These sources are precious, but they are not transparent recordings from a pagan temple. They are layered. They preserve older mythic material, but they also pass through scribal culture, Christian-era learning, poetic memory, and literary arrangement. So the careful phrase is not, "The Vikings believed exactly this." The careful phrase is, in the surviving medieval sources, Ragnarok is remembered this way. One of the most important sources is Völuspá, the prophecy of the seeress, the first poem in the collection now known as the Poetic Edda. The poem is spoken by a mysterious prophetic woman, a Völva, who addresses Odin and tells a vast story: the beginning of the world, the ordering of the cosmos, the deeds of gods, the coming collapse, and the strange renewal that follows. That shape matters. Ragnarok is not simply an ending dropped into the story. It comes after a world has been made, named, inhabited, and remembered. The poem's power comes from the fact that the speaker sees the whole arc at once. Creation and destruction belong to the same vision. Another major source is Snorri's Prose Edda, especially the section called Gylfaginning. Snorri tells myth through a frame narrative. A king named Gylfi, disguised as Gangleri, questions mysterious figures called High, just as High, and Third. They explain the Norse cosmos, the gods, and eventually the fate of the gods. Snorri's version is more systematic than the poem. It arranges events, explains names, and turns prophetic fragments into a sequence a reader can follow. But Snorri is not just copying a modern encyclopedia entry. He is writing in medieval Iceland after Christianization for an audience that includes poets who need to understand old mythic references. His work is one of our best witnesses, but it is also interpretation. This is why Ragnarok should be approached slowly, not as a puzzle with one solved answer, and not as a fantasy battle scene, but as a surviving mythic tradition whose sources are already acts of memory. The warnings come before the final fight. In Völuspá, the world begins to break socially before it breaks cosmically. The poem speaks of kin against kin, of family bonds betrayed, of an axe age, a sword age, a wind age, a wolf age before the world falls. Even without quoting the lines directly, the meaning is stark. The end of the world is not only something that happens in the sky, it happens in human relationships. Brotherhood fails, oaths fail, the moral fabric tears before the heavens do. Snorri gives this unraveling a more narrative form. Before the great battle comes Fimbulwinter, a dreadful winter or sequence of winters with no summer between. Snow drives from all directions, frost is severe, the sun gives little warmth, war spreads, human beings turn on one another. The world becomes colder, both physically and morally. That image is one reason Ragnarok remains so powerful. It does not imagine collapse as instant. It imagines a world that becomes less habitable in stages. Seasons stop behaving like seasons. Trust stops behaving like trust. The rhythm that made life possible becomes unreliable. The cosmos itself then begins to answer. In the mythic geography of Norse tradition, the world is not just a planet in empty space, it is a structured cosmos of realms, roots, waters, halls, boundaries, and beings. The world tree, Yggdrasil, stands at the center of that imagination. Around it and beneath it are wells, serpents, gods, giants, humans, the dead, and powers older than any single story. At Ragnarok, boundaries fail. The wolf is loosed, the hound howls, the serpent rises, the dead move, ships come from impossible directions, the tree trembles, the sun and moon are threatened, stars disappear, mountains shake, the sea leaves its place. These are not just special effects, they are images of a cosmos whose restraints have come undone. Snorri includes one especially strange detail: Naglfar, the ship made from the nails of the dead. In his telling, people should not die with untrimmed nails, because those nails help build the ship that will sail at the end. It is the kind of detail that feels almost folkloric, intimate, and eerie. The end of the world is not only in the heavens, it is also in bodies, funerary care, and small habits around death. But again, we should frame this carefully. This is Snorri's prose tradition. It is not archaeological evidence for a literal ship. It is a mythic image of the dead becoming part of the final loosening. Then comes the sound of the horn. Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, blows Gjallarhorn. The gods gather. Odin rides to seek counsel. Yggdrasil trembles. The old order knows what is coming, and still it must meet it. That is one of the deepest emotional notes in Ragnarok. The gods are not invulnerable. They know fate, they know enough to see the outline of disaster, and yet they do not simply escape it. They go to meet it. Odin, the god of kingship, poetry, war, and ravenous knowledge, faces Fenrir, the great wolf. In the surviving story, Odin falls. The chief of the gods is swallowed. This is not a minor injury in an adventure. It is a symbolic collapse of divine sovereignty. The one who sought wisdom everywhere, who sacrificed for knowledge, who asked the dead and watched the worlds, cannot outthink the final fate. Then Vidar, Odin's son, avenges him. The tradition gives him a strange and powerful role, quiet, strong, associated with the thick shoe that helps him stand against the wolf. The detail is vivid, almost practical, as if the last battle depends not only on glory but on something accumulated and prepared. Thor meets Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent. This is one of the most famous pairings in Norse myth, the thunder god and the world-encircling serpent. They have met before in other stories. At Ragnarok, the conflict reaches its fatal end. Thor kills the serpent, but he walks only 9 paces before falling from its venom. The number of paces gives the scene its sorrow. Victory is real, but not saving. The monster dies, and so does the god. Surt comes from the south with fire, the world burns. The imagery is cosmic, but it should not be rushed. This is not an action climax in the modern sense. It is the collapse of the known order into elemental force. Wolf, serpent, fire, sea, winter, darkness. The sun turns black, the earth sinks into the sea, stars vanish from the sky. In a modern disaster film, that might be the final shot, but in the surviving tradition, it is not quite the end. Ragnarok, the Norse end of the world, Part 2. After the burning, after the wolf, after the serpent, after the gods have fallen and the earth has sunk into the sea, the poem turns. The world rises again. This is one of the most haunting parts of Ragnarok, because the renewal is not simple. It is not a cheerful reset button. It does not erase the grief of what came before. The world that returns is green, but it returns after memory has passed through fire. In Völuspá, the earth rises from the waters. Waterfalls flow, an eagle flies. The surviving gods meet again. They speak of the mighty events that have happened. They find old game pieces in the grass, reminders of an earlier age. The details are quiet, almost domestic, after the cosmic violence. The poem does not end only with destruction, it ends with remembrance. This renewal has generated debate. Some readers have seen in it older pagan cyclic imagery, worlds ending and returning, order breaking and reforming. Others have noticed that the manuscripts preserve these passages in a Christian-era environment, and that certain images can feel colored by Christian hope or judgment. A careful episode should not flatten that complexity. The safest statement is that the surviving texts are layered. They preserve a myth of ending, but also a myth of return. Whether every line reflects pre-Christian belief, Christian-era reshaping, poetic synthesis, or some mixture of all three is not something we can settle by wishful confidence. What we can say is that the Ragnarok tradition we have is not only a myth of annihilation, it is a myth in which memory survives the catastrophe. That may be why it endured. A story that simply says everything ends can be terrifying, but it is also closed. Ragnarok is more unsettling because it says something stranger. Everything you know may end, even the gods may die, even the sun may darken, and still some memory of the world may rise from the water. The older gods are not all restored as they were. The great conflicts have left marks. The renewed world is not just a return to the first chapter. It is an afterworld, a world that knows there was a before. That is why the image of the gods meeting again matters. They remember, they discuss, they find traces. The world has not escaped history, it has inherited it. This is also where the myth touches history in a subtler way. Ragnarok is not historical evidence for one specific catastrophe. It should not be forced into a single volcanic eruption, a comet, a climate event, or a disguised chronicle of conversion. People have tried to make myths into decoded newspapers, and sometimes there are real memories of disasters behind stories. But the responsible approach is different. The historical reality we can speak about with more confidence is the transmission. Medieval Icelandic manuscripts, Eddic poems, Snorri's prose, and the way older mythic material survived in a changing religious and literary world. The overlap of myth and history here is not that archaeology has found the battlefield of the gods. It is that real human communities preserved ways of imagining collapse. They knew winter, they knew feud, they knew ships, they knew sea roads and storms, halls and inheritance, kinship and betrayal. They knew that order was fragile. They knew that rulers died, families broke, settlements failed, and stories outlived the people who first told them. Ragnarok gathers those fears and enlarges them until the entire cosmos participates. The wolf is not only an animal, it is hunger without boundary. The serpent is not only a monster, it is the edge of the inhabited world rising against the land. The winter is not only weather, it is a season that refuses to release its grip. The battle is not only violence, it is the moment when every delayed consequence arrives at once. And the renewal is not only comfort, it is the question of what can remain after the world has been forced to remember its own ending. Modern culture usually loves the middle of the story. The monsters, the hammer, the horn, the fire, those images are powerful, and they are part of why Ragnarok travels so easily into fantasy, metal, comics, games, and film. But if we only take the battle, we miss the slower terror of the myth. The myth begins with relationships breaking. It moves through winter. It shows bonds failing, not just warriors falling. It lets the gods know their fate and meet it anyway. Then it asks whether anything can be remembered after the sky goes dark. That makes Ragnarok more than an apocalypse scene. It becomes a meditation on fatal knowledge. What does courage mean if prophecy cannot be escaped? What does wisdom mean if even Odin cannot prevent the wolf? What does victory mean if Thor can kill the serpent and still die from its venom? What does survival mean if the new world must be built on memory of the old one? The surviving sources do not answer those questions like a philosophical essay. They answer through images: horn, tree, wolf, serpent, winter, fire, green earth. That is the language of myth. It does not give us a clean doctrine. It gives us a set of charged pictures that later generations keep returning to because they say something ordinary language struggles to hold. The world can feel permanent because it is large. Ragnarok says size is not safety. The gods can feel permanent because they are divine. Ragnarok says even gods belong to story, time, and fate. The sun can feel permanent because it rises every day. Ragnarok imagines a day when it does not, but then the earth rises again from the sea. That final movement is why the myth is not only despair. The renewal does not cancel the ending, but it prevents the ending from having the final word. The world after Ragnarok is quieter than the battle. It is not crowded with triumph. It is green, remembered, and strange. Maybe that is closer to how cultures survive catastrophe than a simple victory song. After disasters, people do not return unchanged. They gather fragments. They tell what happened. They argue over meaning. They find old things in the grass. They teach children the names of what was lost. They rebuild not because the past has vanished, but because memory has become part of the foundation. In that sense, Ragnarok is not just about the end of the gods. It is about the survival of narrative after the collapse of certainty. And that brings us back to the manuscripts. The poem itself is a survivor. Snorri's prose is a survivor. The names, images, and fragments of older belief survived by passing through hands that copied, arranged, translated, interpreted, and sometimes misunderstood them. Ragnarok tells of a world destroyed and remembered. The story of Ragnarok reached us because human memory did something similar on a smaller scale. It carried the ruins of a mythic world forward, not perfectly, not unchanged, not without loss, but enough. Enough for a winter to still feel ominous, enough for a tree to seem like more than a tree, enough for a horn in the distance to suggest that the old order has heard its warning, enough for a green world rising from water to feel like one of the oldest hopes human beings have ever had. Where myth and history overlap, truth is often exaggerated into legend. With Ragnarok, the truth is not that the gods literally marched to a battlefield we can excavate. The truth is that people have always known order can fail. Families can break, seasons can turn hostile, the sea can cross its boundary, fire can take what seemed permanent, the powerful can fall, and still, after everything, someone may remain to remember. That is the quiet force of Ragnarok. Not only that the world ends, but that the story imagines what might be left when it does.